Good morning, everyone, and thanks very much, Lance and Promax, to conduct this webinar and invite me for a talk here. I'm going to talk on feeding laying hens. The objective is pretty much to provide you my perspective on what level of energy, lysine, calcium, and NPP we should be feeding to our laying stocks during the peak egg production. And in doing so, I have picked up two ways. One is the model predicted recommendations, and also I shall provide some of the recent empirical evidence to support these numbers. If you look into the genetic development in laying hens, this is Highline International, but this is perhaps representing 2012. And now we can see that flocks are peaking much above this 95–96%, and it is not uncommon to see hen week productions of 98 and even 99%. The target for 80 weeks was set at 378 eggs for white egg layers and 370 eggs for brown egg layers. Also, they provided some performance objectives for extended laying, which is 110 weeks in this case. It was 517, but what we understand now is that people are looking at 100 weeks and 500 eggs. We shall talk about some of the challenges of extended laying cycle, which is now becoming very popular in view that the genetics of these hens allows them to produce high number of eggs and at a very consistent rate. In 80 weeks, the targeted egg mass output for regardless of the white or brown egg laying strains is typically 22 kgs. So this shows overall a very high productive efficiency of the genetics we talk about. I shall start with the response to the nutrient density, and it is one of the older slides from Professor Lysine's work. I have picked up two experiments here which looked into the response of laying hens when diet was diluted with oat hulls. So they had a controlled diet, and quantitatively on weight by weight basis, it was diluted 5, 10, or 15% with the diluent. And what you can see consistently in both these trials, that up to 10% density, the number of eggs and the egg mass output was maintained. So this shows the ability of laying hens actually to be able to adjust their feed intake to keep a constant intake of nutrients to support the genetic set point of egg production. And this is important because it gives us then an opportunity to be able to pick up the desired feed intake, which gives the maximum returns on investment. So for instance, for white egg laying hens, you can then calculate or you can set the maximum feed intake from 95 or up to maybe 105 grams or even more than that, because in many situations we have seen that lower density diets, given the availability of the alternative feed ingredients, may improve return on investment without affecting the growth performance of the laying hens. In terms of the growing phase, the objective would be to maintain a target body weight for age. Some cut points which could differ from companies, but I would suggest 6 weeks, 12 weeks, and 16 weeks as the cutoff points to maintain this body weight. And the idea here is to make our flocks feed the way that they follow the growth trajectory set for the strain throughout the laying cycle. We do not want to correct some of the errors or mistakes made during the earlier phase, because it would then affect the frame size or the composition of gain, which are also important for the laying performance. And also we have seen that the flocks reaching the point of lay with some fat reserves, which is the target would be 50 to 100 grams additional body weight, or the higher than standard body weight, are invariably the best performing flocks. And it is more important for the flocks which are going to peak during the heat stress months, because during the heat stress, inevitably feed intake would be depressed, and hence having some labile fat reserves are expected to be at an advantage, that they can just still mobilize some of the energy to sustain high level of egg production. And on the other hand, very lean hens with no such reserves, in case of depressed feed intake, they would drastically drop their percentage egg production, which is undesirable. Nutrient requirement of all farm animals is a sum of the activities like maintenance. And in maintenance, we talk about BMR and certain allowance for activity. And then for the nutrients are needed for growth, which is quite minimal for the laying hens once they have been moved into the cages or in the laying house. And then the most of the nutrients are diverted to the egg production, which is sum of the egg weight and egg weight x egg production, and we refer to this as egg mass. Egg mass is the actual representative of the nutrient requirements, rather than we cannot take a look on egg weight and egg production separately. This is one graph which has been calculated from this model, and I have taken Highline W36 as an example here. And this graph shows this desired intake of energy from start of lay until 80 weeks of age. And in these calculations, we set up the performance objectives given by the breed. But one thing we need to understand is that it is not uncommon nowadays to see flocks outperforming the breed standards. So these may, the numbers shown here may be slight bit of underestimation for those flocks, but it is a flexible model, so you can actually, based on your input, you can get new numbers. But if you look into the energy intake requirement, it peaks at 40 weeks, and this is the time when hens are producing the maximum egg mass output. And it is very important to understand that the percentage hen production peaks at 30 weeks, but maximum egg mass output is at 40 weeks of age. And during this time, based on these calculations, we believe that 282 kilocalories per hen per day is the desired intake for energy for the peak egg mass output. This is another example on the Highline brown. So similar calculations from starting up to 80 weeks of age. And in this case, peak is achieving a bit earlier. So from 30 to 40, anywhere between 30 to 40 weeks of age. And the peak desired intake for energy in this case is about 312 to 313 kilocalories per hen per day. And it remains fairly constant until 60 weeks of age, and then you would see a slight drop into that. This is desired intake of digestible lysine based on the model calculated numbers. Again, as you can see that at 40 weeks of age, hens are producing the maximum egg mass output, and that would be the time when they need the maximum intake of all nutrients, including protein and essential amino acids. In case of digestible lysine, the calculation shows 691 milligrams digestible lysine intake per hen per day is needed to support the maximum egg production for egg mass output for highline W36. How these numbers compare to some of the recently published reports, I have included a very recent paper from 2019, which looks into the empirical requirement of low-man LSL. So on the x-axis, you would see digestible lysine intake, and on y-axis is the egg mass output. And these researchers adopted two statistical approaches, the quadratic line, which is the curvy linear line here, and another broken line model. And the recommendations are set at the first intersection of the quadratic and broken line, which is the C point here. And you can see these researchers estimated the requirement of digestible lysine at 706 milligrams per hen per day to sustain peak egg production, which was pretty high, which is 57 to 58 grams per hen per day in this study. So this number, 700 milligrams per hen per day, is quite in line with the model predicted number, which was 691 grams. And remember, this 691 was actually an underestimation because the maximum egg mass output in this case was below this, below what they achieved in this research. This is another paper from Silva in 2014 from Livestock Science, and they looked into the recommendations for digestible lysine requirement from 37 up to 42 weeks, 2 weeks of age. And this was a sum of broken line and quadratic model, the approach which we adopted in the previous study. And you can see the mean egg mass output was 61.3 gram, and these researchers recommended 703 milligrams digestible lysine per hen per day. And if we compare that with the model predicted number, so I picked up the same egg mass output, which was given here at 1.45 kilos of body weight, which should typically be the body weight of hens at these age points. And we calculated a requirement estimate of 731 milligrams per hen per day. So the model predicted number actually falls well in line with the most recent estimates on the digestible lysine recommendation. This is the same exercise repeated with Highline Brown, taking the performance objectives given by Highline. So for these birds, the peak allowance would be 745 milligrams digestible lysine per hen per day, which is about 50 milligrams higher than the white egg strains. And this is very well aligned with the work from Netherlands, which suggested that white egg layers require about 700 milligrams, while 50 milligrams higher intake of digestible lysine was needed to sustain maximum egg production for the brown egg laying hens. These are the estimates of the ideal protein ratios from different published sources. So a simplistic approach towards the calcium requirement, which has been tested under many commercial situations now. And this is based on a simple calculation on taking 60 grams, which is the average egg weight for the laying cycle, an eggshell at 11%, you would see 6.6 grams of the eggshell, and it contains about 94% calcium. So what we need is a 2.36 grams calcium intake per hen per day in order to sustain the requirement for the eggshell formation. And I have taken two assumptions here. The one is the calcium digestibility of 60%, which is in the absence of a phytase. And in this case, you would require a dietary calcium level of 3.9% total calcium. And then I have taken another assumption with phytase, which is to assume 70% digestibility of calcium, which is consistent with the work we conducted in AB Vista. And what you can see here is that instead of 3.9% calcium, the analyzed calcium of 3.4% would suffice if you were using phytase. So it is quite a dramatic reduction in the total calcium in the diet, which also gives savings in the feed cost, simply because calcium is a diluent, and by the density factor, it makes diet expensive. So when you reduce down formulated level of calcium from 3.9 down to 3.4%, you straight away see some feed cost savings. And we have now seen that with 600 FTUs of quantum blue phytase, this formulated level, which is 3.4 to 3.5% analyzed calcium, is sufficient to sustain high level of productivity in laying hens. One of the things which I would just highlight here, because I believe my fellow speakers are going to talk in more detail about the eggshell quality and role of calcium and phosphorus, but one of the things which has been now very well known is the requirement of, or the requirement pattern of dietary calcium and phosphorus during different times of the day. So on x-axis, this is the morning, and this is in the afternoon time. What you can see here is that the morning time, when birds are on feed, they would divert calcium and absorb phosphorus for the rehabilitation or reformation of the medullary reserves in the bones. And during the night time, when very little shell quality, and I think we can provide all calcium or all limestone in the coarse particle size in the laying diets. And the second practice, which is also a reflection of this change in the altered requirement of calcium during different parts of the day, is to provide coarser limestone during the evening time. There is another practice which is also, although labor intensive, but in the past we had successfully used this in some large commercial scale farms, and which is to feed low calcium diet, which is about 2% dietary calcium during the morning time, and then feeding rest of the calcium as coarse limestone in the evening. So given the labor cost is not high for this practice, it is also useful in order to achieve good results with the shell quality, with respect to the shell quality. Another paper which was published in 2006, and in this study, the researchers also reached to the similar conclusion that the laying hens can sustain peak egg production for a long period of time, even at a diet with only 0.15% available phosphorus, or non-phytate phosphorus in this case. So you can see no differences in most of the production parameters across 0.25 versus 0.15% NPP. Another study, which is very recent from 2018, again suggesting that even the modern genetics of laying hens with very high production rates, they can still sustain egg production at 0.15% NPP, which is, you can imagine, is quite on the lower side compared with the NPP recommendations given by the major genetic suppliers. So if I summarize these reports on the requirements of NPP, it appears that laying hens during the peak egg production do not require more than 200 milligrams phosphorus per hen per day. For the egg weight is body weight, and you can see one old research from Summer and Leeson here, which shows a linear relationship between the body weight and egg weight. And from more recent estimates, a similar pattern has been observed. So in two different strains, you would see that the pullet weight was something which was the key determinant of the egg weight, both during the early egg weight or the late egg weight. So my conclusion, or if you go into the review of literature, you would conclude that it is really difficult to manipulate egg weight independent of the body weight. Of course, there are certain nutritional strategies which has been published in relation to the nutritional strategies to modulate body egg weight, and I have picked up some random research papers here. So in this first paper from Kishavers, they looked into improving dietary crude protein. So they increased dietary crude protein from 17 up to 21%. So you can see it's a huge increase, but they were able to see very minimal improvement in egg weight, which was about 1 gram on an average across these two treatments. And in addition to that, they also looked into added fat, which was no fat versus 4% added fat, and beyond conventional 80 weeks of age. And a typical target nowadays set is to be able to achieve 500 eggs for 100 weeks. There are three key challenges associated with extended laying cycle, which is the eggshell quality, osteoporosis, and albumin quality. But I would just remind you on strategies of feeding separate calcium or coarse calcium as a way to improve eggshell quality. Phytates could also help. Simply by increasing dietary level of calcium does not work in many cases, and that's not a successful strategy in this respect. Osteoporosis is genetically controlled phenomena, and for the older laying hens, especially after 65 or 70 weeks of age, there are more chances for these structural deformities and lost structural integrity. One of the recommendations for that is to look into superdosing of phytates, for instance, during the growing phase, because in broiler and layer models, we have observed that superdosing with quantum phytase was able to increase the concentration of some of the trace minerals into the bone mass, which most importantly, I would just highlight zinc and magnesium. So we have seen with superdosing of phytase, the zinc and magnesium content of the bone was increased significantly in broiler and layer models, and this could be one strategies to be able to correct this osteoporosis later in the age, because zinc and magnesium are two trace minerals which are associated with the bone strength in addition to calcium and phosphorus. Albumin quality, I believe it is mostly a genetic characteristics, and I was not being able to find out any successful nutritional intervention to be able to improve albumin quality. But one of just concluding remarks, what we observed here is that the laying hens, they still maintain remarkable ability to adjust their feed intake within a reasonable range, which we observe is up to 10%. So the nutritionist or the producers, they can actually, based on this, calculate the optimum intake for their flocks, which gives the maximum return on investment, rather than looking at certain FCR. I think that's more objective parameter. In terms of the energy and digestible lysine intake for the peak lay, we found based on the calculations from the model that we need 280 kilocalories per hen day and 700 milligrams digestible lysine for white egg laying strains, and 300 calories and 750 milligrams per hen per day for brown egg laying strains. And I also provided a couple of published estimates from the recent research which support these numbers. The rest of the essential amino acids, you can follow the ideal ratios, and we discussed most of the published estimates in one slide on ideal protein ratio estimates, which you can use. In terms of the calcium and phosphorus requirement, if you were not using a phytase, which I believe is not practical nowadays, everybody is using that. So we believe that with a phytase, 600 FTUs to 300 to 600 FTUs of phytase, the total calcium of 3.4 grams per hen per day is sufficient. In terms of the NPP requirement, I presented a short review which suggests that the laying hens, both white and brown egg layers, during their peak production, they do not require more than 200 milligrams available or non-phytate phosphorus per hen day. With that,